The millionaire's cruel wife humiliated the maid in front of everyone. 1 minute later, everyone was left speechless by her response. The grand chandelier sparkled above, casting a warm golden glow over the guests as they mingled through the opulent ballroom. Harvey's mansion was the kind of place that seemed to belong in a dream, with its towering ceilings, marble floors, and massive windows offering a breathtaking view of the manicured gardens. Tonight was no exception. The party was in full swing. Laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft hum of classical music filled the air. Lauren, Harvey's wife, stood near the center of the room, basking in the attention of her wealthy peers. Dressed in a sleek silver gown that hugged her slim figure perfectly, she was the picture of elegance on the surface. Her sharp eyes darted around the room, scanning every guest, every conversation. She relished the feeling of being at the top, superior, untouchable. Her smile, however, was only skin deep. Behind that polished exterior lay an icy heart, one that saw the people around her not as equals but as pawns. To Lauren, power was everything, and her power came from her marriage to Harvey, one of the wealthiest men in the city. His fortune had elevated her to this pedestal, and she had no intention of ever stepping down. Emily, the new maid, moved quietly along the edges of the room. She had started working for the family only a few months ago, but her presence was barely noticed by Lauren or her social circle. In her simple black uniform, she blended into the background like a shadow, picking up empty glasses and serving drinks to the guests without making eye contact. For Emily, this job was a lifeline. She had bills to pay, and her family back home relied on the money she sent. She didn't mind the hard work, nor did she care much about the glitz and glamour around her. But tonight, something was different. There was a tension in the air, something almost palpable. Maybe it was the way Lauren's eyes followed her every movement, as if she were just waiting for Emily to make a mistake. And then, it happened. As Emily moved through the crowd, balancing a tray of drinks, she felt her foot catch on the edge of the thick carpet. Time seemed to slow as the tray tipped forward, the glasses sliding off. A glass of deep red wine flew through the air, crashing into the front of Lauren's exquisite gown. The dark liquid spread like a stain of blood across the silver fabric, immediately drawing gasps from those nearby. For a moment, there was silence. Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew what was coming. Lauren's face twisted with fury as she stared down at her ruined dress. "You idiot!" Lauren hissed, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Do you have any idea how much this dress cost? Or are you too stupid to understand something as simple as that?" Emily's face flushed with embarrassment. She opened her mouth to apologize, but Lauren wasn't finished. "This is exactly why people like you will never be anything in life. You're just a worthless maid, and that's all you'll ever be. You can't even carry a tray without ruining everything." The guests around them shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to react. Some exchanged awkward glances, while others pretended not to notice, focusing intently on their drinks. No one dared intervene. After all, Lauren was the queen of the evening, and no one wanted to risk her wrath. But Emily, standing there with the remains of the tray clutched tightly in her hands, suddenly felt a calm wash over her. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to beg for forgiveness. Instead, she raised her head, looking directly at Lauren for the first time all night. "Mrs. Lauren," she said softly, her voice steady, "you forgot that I know your real story." The room went deathly quiet. Lauren's expression faltered for a split second, her eyes narrowing as if trying to understand what Emily had just said. Then, she laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the room. "What on earth are you talking about?" Lauren snapped, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes now. Emily didn't flinch. "I know about your past. I know what you did. And if you don't remember, I'd be happy to remind you." The guests, who had been pretending not to listen, could no longer hide their curiosity. Murmurs spread through the crowd like wildfire, eyes darting between Lauren and Emily. For the first time that evening, Lauren wasn't in control of the room. Harvey, who had been speaking with some of the guests near the entrance, noticed the commotion and began to make his way over. His brow furrowed in confusion as he caught sight of the wine-stained dress and his wife's tense expression. "What's going on here?" Harvey asked, his voice calm but firm as he approached Lauren and Emily. Lauren turned to him, her face tight with barely controlled anger. "This maid," she spat the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth, "has the nerve to try and humiliate me in front of everyone." Harvey looked at Emily, his eyes questioning. "What did you say to her?" Emily met his gaze, unwavering. "I was just reminding Mrs. Lauren that not everything is as perfect as it seems." Harvey frowned, glancing back at his wife, who now looked pale, her composure starting to crack. The tension in the room was thick and everyone could feel it. Emily, standing tall and composed, knew that tonight everything was about to change. The air in the room felt heavy, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Lauren's eyes burned with fury, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of a nearby table. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Emily, a maid, someone she considered beneath her notice. But the calm confidence in Emily's eyes unnerved her. Harvey stood between the two women now, his gaze shifting from his wife's trembling hands to the steady look on Emily's face. He could sense that something important was happening here, something deeper than just a spilled drink. Lauren had a temper, sure, but this felt different. Lauren forced a smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "What exactly are you implying, Emily?" Her voice dripped with disdain, though the laughter from earlier was gone, replaced by a strained edge. Emily remained calm, her expression unchanging. "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Lauren," she replied softly. "I'm stating a fact. I know your real story, the one you've worked so hard to hide." The guests, though they tried to appear casual, were hanging on every word. Even the waitstaff had paused in their duties, subtly glancing over their shoulders to catch the unfolding drama. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. Lauren's face reddened, and for a moment, it looked as though she might strike Emily right there in front of everyone. But she held back, knowing that any further outburst would only worsen the situation. Instead, she turned to Harvey, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Harvey, darling," she said, placing a hand on his arm as if to ground herself. "This girl is delusional. She's trying to embarrass me in front of our guests. Surely you're not going to stand there and let her ruin the evening, are you?" Harvey remained silent, his eyes narrowing as he watched the scene unfold. His gaze shifted to Emily, curious now. "What story is she talking about?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of suspicion. Emily held his gaze, and for a moment, it seemed like time had stopped. She knew that once she said the words, there would be no going back. She would either be believed, or her life here would become infinitely more difficult. But the truth had to come out. She owed it to herself and to those who had suffered in silence because of Lauren's actions. "Mrs. Lauren hasn't been honest with you, Harvey," Emily began, her voice steady. "Not about her past, not about her involvement in certain activities. I'm talking about the money, the manipulations, the things she's done behind your back." A ripple of shock passed through the guests, their whispers growing louder. Lauren's face flushed crimson as she turned on Emily, her voice shaking with barely restrained rage. "How dare you? You're just a maid, a nobody. You don't know anything about my life." But Emily didn't back down. She didn't raise her voice, didn't lose her composure. "You might think that, Mrs. Lauren, but you're wrong," she replied. "I know more than you realize, and I have proof." Lauren's eyes widened for a split second before narrowing again, her mind clearly racing. "What proof? What lies are you trying to spread?" Before Emily could respond, Harvey stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Enough," he said quietly, but there was a firmness in his tone that made everyone stop. He turned to Emily, his eyes serious. "If you have something to say, then say it. What proof are you talking about?" Emily took a breath. "I wasn't always a maid," she began, her gaze never leaving his. "My father used to work for your company, Mr. Harvey. He was the head accountant for over 20 years. He was a good man, dedicated, loyal. But he discovered something he wasn't supposed to. And when he tried to come forward with the truth, things got difficult for him." The room was silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Lauren shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't interrupt this time. Harvey's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you saying, Emily?" "I'm saying that my father found discrepancies in the financial records, discrepancies that pointed to large sums of money being siphoned off into private accounts," Emily continued, her voice unwavering. "Accounts linked to Lauren." Gasps echoed through the room, and Lauren's composure finally cracked. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, her voice high and defensive. "You can't seriously believe her, Harvey. She's just making this up." But Harvey didn't respond immediately. He was staring at Emily, his mind racing. He had always trusted Lauren, but lately, something had felt off. There had been whispers, rumors about shady dealings. He had dismissed them, thinking they were just jealous gossip. But now, Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with sincerity. "My father kept detailed records of everything he found. Mr. Harvey, after he died, I found his files. I know the truth, and I'm willing to show it to you." The room felt as if it had frozen in time. No one dared move. No one even breathed too loudly. All eyes were on Harvey now, waiting for his reaction. Lauren's face was a mask of panic, her eyes darting between Emily and her husband. Harvey finally spoke, his voice low. "Where are these files?" Emily didn't hesitate. "I can bring them to you tomorrow. Everything is in there. Every transaction, every detail." Lauren took a step forward, her voice pleading now. "Harvey, you can't believe her. This is absurd. She's lying. She's trying to—" But Harvey held up a hand, silencing her. "Enough, Lauren." His tone was sharp, final. He turned to Emily again. "I want to see those files, first thing tomorrow." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. She had expected resistance, maybe even disbelief. But Harvey's reaction gave her hope. She knew this wasn't over yet, but the first step had been taken. As the tension slowly began to break, the guests resumed their murmuring, though the mood of the party had shifted completely. Lauren stood frozen, staring at Harvey, her chest heaving with shallow breaths. She had always been in control, until now. And now, her carefully constructed world was starting to crumble. The next morning, Harvey sat in his study, his fingers tapping against the dark wood of his desk. The room was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers as he shifted them absent-mindedly. His thoughts were a whirlwind. Emily's accusations had planted a seed of doubt that he couldn't shake. And now, as he waited for her to arrive with the so-called evidence, his mind ran through every interaction, every subtle change he'd noticed in Lauren over the past few months. Could it really be true? Had Lauren, the woman he had trusted and built a life with, been deceiving him this whole time? A knock at the door broke his train of thought. Harvey straightened in his chair. "Come in," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension gnawing at his insides. Emily entered, holding a large, worn-out folder in her hands. Her usual quiet demeanor was present, but there was a new sense of purpose in the way she carried herself. She met Harvey's eyes with a look of determination. No hesitation, no fear. "I brought the files," she said, placing the folder on his desk. "Everything is in here. The transactions, the discrepancies my father found, and the proof that it all links back to Lauren." Harvey stared at the folder for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Part of him didn't want to open it, didn't want to face whatever truths lay inside. But he had to know. He had to see for himself. With a deep breath, he opened the folder and began to flip through the pages. His eyes scanned the documents, bank statements, emails, and notes scribbled in the margins of financial reports. Slowly, the pieces began to fall into place. The transactions were there, clear as day. Large sums of money siphoned off into accounts under fake names. The evidence was undeniable. Harvey felt a cold wave of disbelief wash over him. His hands shook as he held the papers, the reality of what he was seeing sinking in deeper with every page he turned. This wasn't just a mistake. This was deliberate. This was calculated. And Lauren was behind it. "How?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. He looked up at Emily, who stood quietly across the desk, her face filled with a mix of sympathy and resolve. "How long has this been going on?" "My father discovered it about 3 years ago," Emily replied softly. "He tried to bring it to your attention, but, well, Lauren found out. She made sure he was silenced. After he died, I found his files hidden away. I didn't know what to do at first, but I knew you had to know the truth." Harvey closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of betrayal settle heavily on his shoulders. 3 years. For 3 years, the woman he had shared his life with had been stealing from him, manipulating him, and covering her tracks. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the trust she had shattered. Emily continued, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harvey. I didn't want to cause problems, but I couldn't let her get away with it. Not after everything she's done." Harvey opened his eyes. The storm of emotions swirling inside him barely kept in check. Anger, confusion, hurt, all of it crashing down at once. He stared at the documents again, each line of numbers another dagger to his chest. "I had my suspicions," Harvey admitted, his voice low. "I'd heard things, whispers, rumors, but I never thought—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "She's been careful," Emily said. "She knows how to play the game, but she underestimated me. And she underestimated you." Harvey looked at Emily, seeing her not as a mere maid, but as someone who had been brave enough to bring the truth to light, even when it could have cost her everything. There was strength in her that he hadn't noticed before, a quiet resilience that demanded respect. "I don't know how to thank you," Harvey said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me than I can ever repay." Emily shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Harvey. I just wanted to make sure you knew the truth." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Harvey's mind raced with the implications of what he had just discovered. He knew what had to be done, but the thought of confronting Lauren, of unraveling the life they had built together, was daunting. "What do I do now?" Harvey asked, almost to himself. Emily hesitated for a second before responding. "You need to confront her. You deserve answers. But you need to be careful. Lauren, she's not going to let go easily." Harvey nodded slowly, absorbing her words. He knew Emily was right. Lauren was cunning. And if she felt cornered, she would lash out. He had to be prepared. "I'll handle it," Harvey said finally, his voice steadier now. "But I need to think about how this is going to get messy." Emily stood quietly, understanding that her part in this was nearly over. She had delivered the truth. Now it was up to Harvey to decide what to do with it. "If there's anything else you need," she offered, "I'm here." Harvey gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you, Emily. I mean it." She left the room, closing the door softly behind her. Harvey sat in silence for a few moments, staring down at the incriminating papers spread out in front of him. His world had just been turned upside down, and nothing would ever be the same. He knew that once he confronted Lauren, there would be no going back. The life they had shared would be over. But for the first time in a long time, Harvey felt a strange sense of clarity. The fog that had clouded his mind, the doubts that had nagged at him, were finally starting to lift. Lauren had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and now she would have to face the consequences. Later that day, Lauren was in her private sitting room, reclined on a velvet chaise, flipping through a fashion magazine with a glass of champagne in hand. To anyone looking in from the outside, She appeared the picture of luxury. Her silk robe draped elegantly over her slender figure, the soft glow of afternoon light streaming through the tall windows casting her in a golden hue. But her mind wasn't on the glossy pages in front of her. She couldn't shake the encounter from the night before. Emily's words had been gnawing at her since the moment they were uttered. "I know your real story." Those 5 words had pierced through the veneer of control Lauren had always kept so tightly around her. How could Emily know anything? It was impossible, wasn't it? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Harvey entered the room, his expression grim. Lauren straightened slightly, setting the magazine aside, a wary look crossing her face. She could sense something was off. "What is it, Harvey?" she asked, her voice tinged with impatience. Harvey stood at the edge of the room for a moment, as if deciding how to begin. The weight of the truth he had uncovered that morning still hung heavily on him, but the time had come. He couldn't avoid it any longer. "We need to talk," he said, his voice firm but calm. Lauren's brow furrowed. She sat up straighter, eyeing him cautiously. "Talk about what?" Harvey moved further into the room, his gaze never leaving hers. He placed the folder on a nearby table, the sight of it immediately catching Lauren's attention. "Emily came to me this morning," he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside him. "She brought me some documents I think you might want to explain." Lauren's face paled slightly, but she quickly masked it with a scoff. "Emily?" she sneered. "You're taking that girl's word over mine. What on earth could she have possibly—" "Stop," Harvey interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make Lauren fall silent. He took a breath before continuing. "I've seen the evidence, Lauren. I've seen everything." A cold silence fell between them. Lauren stared at him, her face a mixture of confusion and growing panic. What evidence?" she asked, her voice smaller now. Harvey's jaw tightened. He reached for the folder and pulled out the documents, spreading them across the table in front of her. "These," he said, his voice low, "bank statements, financial reports, transactions you never told me about." Lauren's heart raced as she glanced at the papers. She didn't need to read them to know what they were. Her carefully constructed world of deceit was being laid out before her, piece by piece, and the walls were closing in. "How long has this been going on?" Harvey demanded, his voice filled with a controlled anger. "How long have you been lying to me?" Lauren stood up, her body tense as she tried to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, though her voice wavered. "This is ridiculous, Harvey. You know me. You know I would never—" "I thought I knew you," Harvey cut in, his voice rising slightly. "But now, I don't know anymore." He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers for any hint of remorse, any sign that she might come clean. But all he saw was the same cold, calculating look she had worn for years. "You betrayed me, Lauren. You stole from me. And for what? For money you didn't need." Lauren's face twisted into a mask of defiance. "You don't understand," she snapped. "I did what I had to do to protect us, to protect our future." "Protect us," Harvey repeated, incredulous. "By stealing from me? By lying to me? You put everything at risk, Lauren. Everything we built together. I was securing our position." Lauren's voice was desperate now. "Do you think those board members would have left us with anything if I hadn't stepped in? They were vultures, Harvey. I had to take control, or we would have lost it all." Harvey shook his head, disbelief written across his face. "That's what this is about. Control? You wanted more control, so you thought it was okay to steal? To manipulate everything behind my back?" Lauren clenched her fists, her frustration boiling over. "You were too weak to see it, Harvey. You let them walk all over you. I had to take matters into my own hands because you weren't willing to fight for what was ours." Harvey stared at her, a deep sadness settling in his chest. So this was never about us. This was about you. Your need for power. Lauren didn't respond. She knew she had lost control of the situation, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Not yet. Harvey's voice softened, but the pain in his eyes was undeniable. I loved you, Lauren. I trusted you. And you threw all of that away for what? Greed. Power. For a moment, Lauren faltered. She opened her mouth to say something, anything to salvage what was left, but the words wouldn't come. Her carefully constructed persona was crumbling, and she could feel it slipping from her grasp. I don't know who you are anymore, Harvey said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of anger and sorrow. But I know one thing. You don't deserve my trust. You don't deserve any of this. Lauren's heart pounded in her chest as the realization finally hit her. She was losing him. Everything she had worked for, everything she had manipulated, was slipping through her fingers. Harvey, please, she whispered, stepping toward him. I can fix this. I'll make it right. Harvey shook his head, stepping back. It's too late for that, Lauren. The finality of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Lauren felt true fear. This wasn't just a disagreement, wasn't just a bump in the road. This was the end. Harvey turned away, his heart heavy with the weight of the betrayal. We're done here, he said quietly, heading toward the door. As the door closed behind him, Lauren stood frozen in place, her mind racing with the magnitude of what had just happened. The world she had fought so hard to control was collapsing, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Harvey stormed down the hallway, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The truth weighed heavy on him. Lauren's lies, her manipulations, everything he had built his life on was crumbling. As he reached his office, he slammed the door behind him and leaned against the desk, trying to make sense of it all. He had always prided himself on being able to read people, to see through deception, yet Lauren had fooled him for years. He had loved her, trusted her with everything. And now he was left standing in the ruins of a marriage he thought was real. But there was something else gnawing at him, something that didn't quite sit right. Emily's involvement. She had come forward with the truth, and while Harvey was grateful, the question still lingered. Why now? Why had she waited so long? As if on cue, a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Emily entered the room, her expression calm but serious, as if she had been expecting this moment. You wanted to see me, Mr. Harvey? She asked, standing just inside the door. Harvey didn't waste any time. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk, his voice steady but sharp. Sit down, Emily. We need to talk. Emily did as he asked, folding her hands in her lap. She looked at him, her eyes clear and unwavering, as though she already knew what he was going to ask. Harvey took a deep breath, pacing slightly before finally facing her. You've helped me, Emily. You've shown me the truth about Lauren, and I'm grateful for that. But I need to know why. Why now? Why did you wait so long to bring this to me? Emily didn't flinch at the question. She seemed to have expected it. Because, Mr. Harvey, I had to be sure. I had to have everything in order before I came to you. I knew the risks involved, and I didn't want to bring you incomplete information. But you've known for months, haven't you? Harvey pressed, his voice a little harsher than he intended. You had all this time, and yet you waited. Why? Emily's gaze softened slightly, but she remained composed. It wasn't an easy decision. I knew what exposing Lauren would mean, for her, for you, for everyone involved. I wasn't sure how you'd react. I didn't know if you'd believe me. Harvey leaned against the desk, crossing his arms. You were afraid I'd take her side. Emily nodded slightly. It crossed my mind. You and Lauren have been together for a long time. I didn't want to destroy your marriage if you weren't ready to see the truth. He frowned, the tension in his shoulders still tight. But what if I hadn't believed you? What if I had turned against you? You could have lost everything. I knew the risks, Emily replied quietly. But I had to do what was right. My father, he tried to do the right thing, and it cost him everything. I couldn't let his work be buried along with him. Harvey's brow furrowed. Your father was the accountant, right? Emily nodded. He was loyal to you, Mr. Harvey. He worked for your family for over 2 decades. When he found out what Lauren was doing, he tried to confront her, but she made sure his voice was never heard. Harvey felt a knot tighten in his chest. What do you mean? Emily's voice softened, her eyes clouded with memories. My father confronted Lauren privately. He told her that if she didn't come clean, he'd take it to you. But the next day, everything changed. Lauren found a way to discredit him, to make it look like he was the one stealing. She threatened to ruin him, to ruin our family. He couldn't take it. He kept quiet, but it ate away at him. Harvey's jaw tightened. He hadn't known any of this. How had he missed so much? And after he passed away, Emily continued, her voice filled with quiet resolve. I found his files. He had kept everything, every record, every transaction. He was going to come to you, Mr. Harvey, but Lauren silenced him before he had the chance. Harvey ran a hand through his hair, anger boiling in his chest. Lauren's manipulation, it goes deeper than I thought. Emily nodded. I waited because I wanted to make sure you were ready to hear it. And when I saw the way things were going, the way Lauren treated you, the way she treated everyone, I knew it was time. Harvey exhaled slowly, letting the weight of her words sink in. Emily had risked everything to bring the truth to light, and he couldn't help but respect her for it. But that didn't make the situation any less complicated. What do I do now? Harvey asked, almost to himself. Emily looked at him, her voice steady. You do what you know is right. Lauren has betrayed you in more ways than one. She doesn't deserve your protection. Harvey nodded, but there was still a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. And you? You've been helping me this whole time. Why? Emily hesitated for a brief moment before answering. Because my father believed in you, Mr. Harvey. He believed in your integrity, in your fairness. He thought you deserved to know the truth. And I believe that too. Harvey looked at her, a mix of gratitude and sorrow in his gaze. I can't undo what's been done, but I can make sure Lauren answers for what she's done. Emily stood up, her expression resolute. That's all anyone can ask. As she turned to leave, Harvey spoke again, his voice softer this time. Emily, thank you. She paused at the door, glancing back at him. You don't need to thank me, Mr. Harvey. Just do the right thing. And with that, she was gone, leaving Harvey alone with his thoughts once more. As the door clicked shut, Harvey felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The road ahead was clear, but it wasn't going to be easy. He knew that confronting Lauren would tear apart the life they had built. But he also knew that there was no other choice. Lauren had betrayed him, and the truth couldn't be buried any longer. The next few days passed like a blur. The weight of what had transpired hung heavily over the mansion, casting a shadow over everything. Harvey avoided Lauren as much as he could, retreating into his office to pore over the evidence Emily had brought him. He was piecing together every detail, every lie, every stolen dollar. But the hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was the realization that the woman he had built his life around wasn't who he thought she was. Lauren, on the other hand, was determined to regain control. She had felt it slipping from her grasp the moment Emily opened her mouth at the party. Harvey had been distant ever since, and she knew that distance was dangerous. But Lauren wasn't someone who gave up easily. She had fought her way to the top, and she wasn't about to let a maid or anyone else ruin what she had worked so hard to build. One afternoon, Lauren found Harvey in his study, reviewing yet another stack of papers. Her patience was running thin. She stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind her, and crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp. Harvey didn't look up at her. He continued flipping through the papers, his silence only fueling her frustration. "Harvey," she tried again, her voice harder now. "I'm not going to let this go. You've been ignoring me for days, and I want answers." Finally, Harvey looked up, his eyes cold and distant. "Answers," he echoed. "You want answers?" "Yes, I do," Lauren replied, her tone growing defensive. "You've been acting like I'm the enemy. And for what? Because of some ridiculous accusations from that maid." "Emily," Harvey said, correcting her. "Her name is Emily, and she's not just some maid. She brought me proof, Lauren. Proof of what you've been doing behind my back." Lauren's jaw clenched, but she wasn't ready to admit defeat. "And you believe her?" she asked, her voice incredulous. "You're really going to take her word over mine, after all these years?" "I'm not taking anyone's word," Harvey shot back, his voice growing firmer. "I've seen the documents. I've seen the transactions. You've been stealing from me, Lauren. From our company. From our life." Lauren's eyes flashed with anger, but there was something else there, too. Fear. She had spent so long carefully constructing her world of deceit that the idea of it crumbling terrified her more than anything. "I did what I had to do," she said, her voice low but fierce. "You don't understand how cutthroat the business world is. I was protecting us, protecting our future." Harvey slammed the folder shut, the loud thud echoing through the room. "Protecting us," he repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "By stealing from me, by lying to me for years." Lauren stepped forward, her frustration boiling over. "I was saving us, Harvey." "You've always been too soft, too trusting. You don't know what it's like out there. Those people, the board members, they would have eaten you alive if I hadn't stepped in. I was the one holding everything together." Harvey stood up, his eyes flashing with anger. "You weren't holding anything together, Lauren. You were tearing it apart from the inside. And you didn't do it for us. You did it for yourself. You wanted control. You wanted power. And you didn't care who you hurt along the way." Lauren's face twisted with anger, her pride wounded. "I did what was necessary. You would have let them walk all over us." Harvey shook his head, his voice filled with disappointment. "This was never about us, Lauren. It was always about you, your greed, your ambition." Lauren opened her mouth to argue, but Harvey cut her off, his voice hard and unyielding. "You put everything at risk, not just our marriage, but the company, the people who work for us. You stole from your own husband, from the man who trusted you more than anyone else in the world." For the first time, Lauren faltered. Her confidence wavered as she saw the finality in Harvey's eyes. He wasn't going to back down. The control she had clung to for so long was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "What do you want me to say, Harvey?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost pleading. "I did what I thought was right. I was trying to protect us." Harvey's expression hardened. "I don't believe that anymore. You weren't protecting us, Lauren. You were protecting yourself, and now it's over." The silence that followed was deafening. Lauren stood there, her pride wounded, her mind racing for a way out, but for the first time in years she found herself cornered. Harvey turned away from her, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'm going to undo all the damage you've caused. The money you stole, it's going back. Every cent." Lauren's heart dropped into her stomach. She had expected a fight, but she hadn't expected this. Divorce. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Her carefully crafted world was unraveling faster than she could have ever imagined. "Harvey, wait," she began, but her voice cracked. She tried again, this time more desperately. "We can fix this. I can fix this." But Harvey didn't turn around. He stood with his back to her, his voice cold and final. "It's too late for that, Lauren." Lauren felt her chest tighten, panic setting in. She had always been in control, always the one pulling the strings, but now it was slipping away, and she didn't know how to stop it. As Harvey walked out of the room, leaving her standing there in the wreckage of their marriage, Lauren felt the full weight of her decisions crashing down on her. For the first time in her life, she was truly powerless, and she had no one to blame but herself. Lauren's world, once so perfectly manicured and controlled, began to unravel faster than she could grasp. The fallout from Harvey's decision to file for divorce spread through their social circles like wildfire. What had once been whispers of her arrogance and ruthless nature had now turned into open conversations about her dishonesty and betrayal. The people she had relied on, the ones who once clung to her every word, were beginning to distance themselves. The first sign came when she tried to call a close friend, Victoria, someone she had known for years. Victoria had always been her confidant, the person she shared secrets with, at least the ones Lauren wanted known. But when Lauren's call went straight to voicemail, she knew something had shifted. She called again, more insistent this time. When Victoria finally picked up, her voice was different. Cool, distant. "Victoria," Lauren began, her voice more pleading than she intended. "I need to talk to you. It's about Harvey. Things are complicated." A pause on the other end. Lauren could almost hear the hesitation. "I don't think that's a good idea, Lauren," Victoria finally said, her voice detached. "People are talking. There's been, well, a lot of rumors." Lauren's grip on the phone tightened. "Rumors? You know how people talk, none of it's true, it's just exaggerated." But Victoria didn't seem convinced. "I'm not sure, Lauren. Look, I don't want to get involved. Maybe it's best if we both take some time apart for a while, until things settle." And just like that, the line went dead. Victoria wasn't the first friend to pull away, and she wouldn't be the last. Day by day, Lauren's carefully constructed social network crumbled. The invitations she once received to every important event, the dinners, the parties, the exclusive galas, suddenly, they stopped coming. Harvey, on the other hand, seemed to move through the storm with quiet determination. He had kept the details of their divorce out of the public eye as much as possible, but the truth was too big to contain forever. People whispered about the real reason behind it, and soon, the truth of Lauren's betrayal spread. Meanwhile, in the mansion, the staff, who had always been beneath her notice, began to exchange looks when she walked past. They had heard what Emily had done. They knew what Lauren had been hiding. And while they didn't dare confront her directly, their silence was a judgment in itself. Where once they might have hurried to meet her demands, now they moved just a little slower, barely acknowledging her presence unless absolutely necessary. Lauren could feel it, the shift in the atmosphere, the loss of control. It was suffocating. She tried to salvage what was left, calling up her lawyers, attempting to mitigate the fallout from Harvey's decision to return the stolen funds. But it was no use. Harvey was meticulous, and with the evidence Emily had provided, the financial institutions were more than willing to cooperate. He was already in the process of reversing every illicit transaction, ensuring the money Lauren had diverted would go to the charities he had chosen. Her desperation grew with every day that passed. She couldn't believe how quickly everything was slipping away. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The final blow came when she tried to reach out to one of her business contacts, someone she had previously had leverage over. She was hoping to cash in on a favor, something to keep her afloat while the divorce went through. But instead of the eager response she was used to, she was met with a cold, impersonal rejection. "Mrs. Lauren," the email read, "due to recent developments, we regret to inform you that we will be severing all future business ties with you, effective immediately. We appreciate your past contributions, but given the current circumstances, we cannot continue our partnership." Lauren stared at the screen in disbelief. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had built these connections, these relationships. How could they all turn their backs on her so easily? her pride wouldn't let her accept it at first. She made a few more calls, sent more emails, but the results were always the same. Doors that were once open were now firmly shut. The social elite that had once welcomed her with open arms were no longer interested. Without Harvey's backing, without the security of their shared wealth and influence, Lauren was nothing more than a liability. And while Lauren's world was collapsing, Emily's life in the mansion was changing in ways she hadn't expected. The staff had always treated her with quiet respect. But after her role in uncovering Lauren's deception came to light, that respect grew. People whispered about her courage, about how she had risked everything to do the right thing. Even Harvey seemed to look at her differently. Though their interactions remained professional, there was a new sense of trust between them. He asked her opinion on small matters around the house, sought her insight on things he might have once overlooked. And Emily, who had once moved through the halls of the mansion as quietly and invisibly as possible, now found herself stepping into a more visible role. The other maids began to look to her for guidance, and Harvey himself seemed to appreciate her presence more each day. Emily never sought to take advantage of this newfound attention. She wasn't after power or influence. She simply did her job with the same quiet dignity she always had, but there was no denying the shift in how she was perceived. Lauren noticed it too. One morning, as she passed by Emily in the hall, she could feel the change in the air. Where once she might have sneered, now there was an uncomfortable silence. Lauren, who had once treated Emily as beneath her, now felt a sense of unease in her presence. It was as if the balance of power had shifted without either of them acknowledging it. Lauren's attempts to reassert her dominance over the household fell flat. The staff no longer jumped at her demands. They still did their jobs, of course, but the fear, the anxiety she had once instilled in them was gone. Emily had shattered that illusion. And for the first time in her life, Lauren felt something she had never truly experienced before: helplessness. The cracks in her carefully constructed facade had grown too wide to mend. The people who had once admired her now looked at her with disdain or, worse, indifference. She had built her life on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and control, and now that foundation was crumbling beneath her feet. As she retreated into the shadows of her once glamorous life, Lauren could only watch as Harvey and Emily quietly moved forward, their lives continuing to grow while hers fell apart. And the worst part of all, Lauren had no one to blame but herself. Harvey sat in his office, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the room. He stared out the window at the expansive garden, his mind far away from the beauty in front of him. Everything had changed, and yet, here he was, at the center of it all, still trying to make sense of the wreckage of his marriage, his life, and the betrayal that had been festering right under his nose. It had been weeks since the confrontation with Lauren, weeks since Emily had laid everything bare. The divorce papers were in the works, and the charitable donations were already being processed. Lauren was fighting it, of course, scrambling to retain as much as she could. But Harvey had been methodical. His lawyers were prepared, and they had the upper hand. He had Emily's proof, and with that, Lauren's power was all but gone. Still, Harvey couldn't shake the weight of it all. He had spent years building his life with Lauren, trusting her, and now it was all unraveling. But amidst the chaos, one thing had remained clear: Emily's role in all of this. She had not only brought the truth to light, but had supported him through the entire ordeal. And now, as he looked out at the garden, he found himself wondering why. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Harvey called, his voice heavy with the weight of the day. The door opened, and Emily stepped in, her expression calm as always. "Mr. Harvey, you wanted to see me?" Harvey nodded, gesturing for her to sit. "Yes, Emily, I've been thinking about everything that's happened." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've helped me a lot, more than anyone else has, and I can't help but wonder, why?" Emily looked at him for a moment, her face thoughtful. She had known this question would come eventually, but she had been preparing herself for it. "Mr. Harvey, it wasn't just about helping you. It was about doing what was right. My father, he always believed in your integrity, in your ability to lead the company with fairness. He was devastated when he realized what Lauren had been doing. He didn't have the strength to fight back, but I knew that if he were here, he'd want me to make things right. Harvey listened in silence, absorbing her words. There was something about the way she spoke, so calm, so sincere, that made him realize just how deeply this had affected her. This wasn't just about revenge or exposing Lauren. This was personal for Emily. I understand that, Harvey said after a long pause. But still, you didn't have to get involved. You could have kept quiet. You could have walked away and left everything in the dark. Emily looked down for a moment, as if collecting her thoughts. I thought about it, she admitted. But then I realized that I couldn't live with myself if I let her get away with it. My father gave his life to that company, to your family. I couldn't stand by and watch her destroy everything he believed in. Harvey leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. He hadn't known Emily's father well, but he remembered him as a loyal and hard-working man. It made sense now. Emily wasn't just doing this for herself. She was doing it to honor her father's legacy. I owe you more than I can ever repay, Harvey said quietly, his eyes meeting hers. You've done more for me than anyone else, and I'm not sure I would have had the strength to face the truth without your help. Emily shook her head slightly. You don't owe me anything, mister. Harvey, I didn't do this for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do. Harvey was silent for a moment, watching her. There was a resilience in Emily that he admired, a quiet strength that had kept her grounded through all of this. And as he looked at her, he realized that he had come to rely on her more than he had realized. I need to tell you something, Harvey said, his voice steady but serious. Something I've been keeping to myself for a while. Emily frowned slightly, her curiosity piqued. What is it? Harvey took a deep breath, knowing that what he was about to say would change everything. I knew about Lauren long before you brought me those documents, he confessed, his voice low. I had my suspicions. I just didn't want to believe them. Emily's eyes widened slightly, surprise flickering across her face. You knew? Harvey nodded. I had noticed small things, strange transactions, inconsistencies in the company's finances. I didn't want to believe that Lauren was behind it, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I was just too afraid to face it. Emily leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. Then why didn't you say anything? Harvey's jaw clenched as he stared at the desk in front of him. Because I didn't have the proof. I didn't want to accuse her of something so terrible without solid evidence. I kept hoping I was wrong, that there was some explanation. Emily's voice was gentle when she spoke. But you weren't wrong. Harvey nodded, his throat tightening with the weight of the admission. No, I wasn't. And when you came to me with the files, it was like everything I had been trying to ignore was suddenly staring me in the face. You gave me the push I needed to finally confront her. Emily looked down, processing what he had just said. She had always believed that Harvey was in the dark about Lauren's deception, but now she realized that he had been fighting his own internal battle for a long time. I didn't know, Emily said quietly. I didn't know you were already dealing with it. Harvey smiled slightly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I suppose that makes us allies in this, doesn't it? Emily looked up at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. I guess it does. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. But for the first time in a long time, Harvey didn't feel alone in the mess that his life had become. Emily had been there from the beginning, helping him through the worst of it. And now, as they sat there, he realized just how much he had come to depend on her. Thank you, Harvey said quietly, his voice sincere, for everything. Emily met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding. You're welcome, Mr. Harvey. As she stood to leave, Harvey watched her go, a strange sense of peace settling over him. Things were still far from perfect, but for the first time, he felt like he was finally starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And with Emily by his side, he knew he had the strength to face whatever came next. Lauren sat in the living room, staring blankly at the fire crackling in the hearth. The once comforting warmth felt hollow now, like everything else in her life. The silence in the mansion was deafening, a stark contrast to the lively parties and events that used to fill these halls. All of it felt so distant now, as if it had belonged to someone else entirely. She glanced at her phone on the table, hoping for any message or call, any sign that someone or anyone still stood by her side. But the screen remained dark, as it had for days. Her friends, the ones she had carefully cultivated over the years, had all fallen away. One by one, they had distanced themselves from her. Without Harvey's influence and the wealth that came with it, she was no longer the queen of her social circle. She was nothing. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, pulling Lauren from her thoughts. Harvey appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. She knew this moment was coming. She had known it ever since he confronted her with the documents. But knowing didn't make it any easier. "Lauren," Harvey said, his voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." Lauren straightened in her chair, trying to maintain a semblance of dignity, though inside she felt as if she were crumbling. "I assume this is about the divorce." Harvey stepped further into the room, standing just a few feet away from her. "Yes, it is." She swallowed, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair tightly. "You really think this is necessary? We've built a life together, Harvey. You can't just throw that away." Harvey's expression remained firm. "I'm not throwing anything away, Lauren. You did that when you betrayed me, when you lied, manipulated, and stole from me." Her jaw clenched, the sharp edge of anger flashing in her eyes. "I did what I had to do. You were too soft, too trusting. I was protecting what we built." Harvey's voice rose slightly, the calm mask slipping just enough to reveal the frustration underneath. "You weren't protecting anything. You were protecting yourself. You took what wasn't yours, and you didn't care who got hurt in the process." Lauren stood up, her fists clenched at her sides. "So, what now? You're going to leave me with nothing, after everything I've done for you?" Harvey met her gaze, his eyes hardening. "You'll get what you deserve, Lauren. The money you stole is being returned. And as for the rest, you'll have the settlement from the divorce, but don't expect anything more." Lauren's heart raced, panic beginning to set in. "You can't do this to me, Harvey. You can't take everything from me." Harvey's tone softened slightly, though there was no room for negotiation in his words. "I'm not taking everything, Lauren. You still have a chance to start over. But I won't let you continue to live off the lies and deceit you built." Lauren took a step toward him, her voice pleading now. "Harvey, please, I made mistakes. Yes, but we can fix this. We can rebuild. I can change." Harvey shook his head, the sadness in his eyes unmistakable. "It's too late for that. We're past the point of fixing things, Lauren. The trust is gone, and without that, there's nothing left." She froze, the finality of his words sinking in. He was serious. He was really going through with it. There would be no saving their marriage, no salvaging her life as she knew it. "When are you filing?" Lauren asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow," Harvey replied, his tone firm. "My lawyer is finalizing the paperwork. Once it's filed, we'll move forward with the division of assets. I've made sure that everything will be handled fairly." Lauren sat back down, her legs feeling weak. The fire crackled in the background, but the warmth didn't reach her. She was cold. The kind of cold that came from deep inside, the kind that no fire could chase away. "You've already made up your mind," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Yes," Harvey said quietly. "I have." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their shared history, the years they had spent building a life together, hung in the air like a ghost. But that life was gone now, and nothing either of them said could bring it back. Lauren turned her gaze to the fire, her thoughts racing. She had always believed she could control everything, that she could manipulate her way through any situation. But this was different. Harvey was no longer the man she could influence with charm or false promises. He had seen through her, and now there was no way back. Harvey watched her for a moment longer, the sadness in his chest heavy. He had loved Lauren once, deeply. But the woman standing before him now was not the same person he had married. Or perhaps she had always been this way, and he had been too blind to see it. "I'll have the papers delivered to you tomorrow," Harvey said softly, his voice no longer sharp but resigned. "I hope you'll sign them without a fight." Lauren didn't respond. She couldn't. All she could do was stare into the fire and feel the last remnants of her life slipping away. Harvey turned to leave, but as he reached the door, he paused, glancing back at her one last time. "I hope you find a way to move forward, Lauren. I really do." And with that, he was gone, leaving Lauren alone in the quiet, empty mansion that had once been her kingdom. The silence that followed was crushing. The reality of her situation settled over her like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. Her empire was crumbling, and there was no one left to help her pick up the pieces. The divorce, once just a distant threat, was now a cold, hard reality. Harvey had made his decision, and Lauren knew deep down that there was no turning back. As the fire flickered weakly in the hearth, Lauren sat in the dim light, her mind numb. She had always believed that power and control were everything, that they could shield her from any downfall. But now, she understood how fragile it all had been. She had been the architect of her own destruction, and now she had to live with the consequences. Tomorrow, the papers would arrive, and with them, the final chapter of her marriage would come to an end. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Harvey's office, casting a soft glow over the room. It had been a few days since he filed for divorce, and the weight of that decision still hung over him, though lighter now. The mansion, once a symbol of shared power between him and Lauren, felt different, quieter, more peaceful. The echoes of betrayal were still there, but they were fading, replaced by a sense of resolution. He sat behind his desk, staring at the pile of paperwork still to be signed, but his thoughts were far from the documents. Instead, his mind drifted to Emily. Over the past weeks, she had become more than just someone who worked in the house. She had been the steady anchor in the storm, guiding him through some of the darkest moments of his life with grace and unwavering support. The quiet knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Harvey called, knowing instinctively who it was. Emily stepped into the room, holding a tray with a pot of coffee and 2 cups. "I thought you could use a break," she said, her voice soft but full of warmth. Harvey smiled, grateful for the distraction. "You know me too well." She set the tray down on the table near the window, pouring a cup for Harvey and then one for herself. "I've learned a few things over the past few months," she said with a small smile, handing him the cup. He took it, wrapping his hands around the warm mug, but he didn't sip it right away. Instead, he looked at Emily, studying her face. She was calm, as always. But there was something deeper there, something he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. "Emily," he began, his voice softer than usual, "you've done so much for me, more than I could ever ask for." Emily sat down across from him, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "I just did what was right, Mr. Harvey." Harvey shook his head slightly. "No, it's more than that. You stood by me when I didn't even know I needed help. You brought the truth to light, even when it could have cost you everything. You've been my strength through all of this." Emily looked down for a moment, taking in his words, then met his gaze again. "I didn't do it for recognition. I just couldn't stand by and let Lauren destroy everything. Not after what my father went through." There was a pause as Harvey nodded, his eyes full of understanding. I know, and I'm grateful for that." He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he needed to say. "But I've realized something else. Through all of this, you've become more than just someone who works for me. You've become someone I trust, someone I care about." Emily's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed uncertain. "Mr. Harvey, Please," Harvey interrupted gently. "Call me Harvey." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they looked at each other, the unspoken understanding passing between them. Emily had always been reserved, keeping herself at a distance, but now that distance seemed unnecessary, almost unnatural. "Harvey," Emily finally said, her voice soft. "I didn't expect this. You never thought I'd see you as anything more than an employee," Harvey finished for her. "But I do. I have for a while now. You're different, Emily. You see people for who they really are, not what they have. You don't care about status or wealth. You care about integrity, about doing what's right, and that's rare." Emily blushed slightly, looking down at her cup. "I just try to do my best, and that's all." Harvey set his coffee aside and leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "And you've done more than that. You've made me see things I couldn't see before. You've reminded me of what really matters." Emily lifted her gaze to meet his, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. "You've always had that in you, Harvey. You just needed someone to remind you." There was a pause as the truth of her words settled between them. Harvey knew she was right. He had let his marriage to Lauren blind him to so many things, his values, his judgment, even his own sense of self-worth. But now, with Emily's help, he felt like he was seeing the world with new eyes. He reached across the table, his hand resting lightly on hers. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it spoke volumes. Emily looked down at their hands, then back up at him, her expression softening. "I don't know where this will go," Harvey said quietly, his voice honest. "But I know one thing. I don't want to lose the connection we've built." Emily smiled, a warmth spreading across her face. "Neither do I." They sat in the quiet for a moment longer, the weight of the conversation slowly lifting as they both began to accept the new direction their lives were taking. Harvey felt lighter than he had in months, as if the chains that had held him down for so long were finally beginning to break. But Emily, as always, remained practical. "What will you do next?" she asked gently, as if guiding him toward the next step in his journey. Harvey exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know yet. The divorce isn't finalized, but I know things are going to change, drastically. Lauren will fight it every step of the way, but I've made my peace with that." Emily nodded, understanding the challenges he still faced. "You'll get through it. You're stronger than you think." Harvey smiled at her, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thanks to you." There was another pause before Harvey stood up, walking over to the window. He looked out at the garden, the same one that had brought him so much comfort over the years, and felt a sense of peace wash over him. "I've decided," he said after a moment, turning back to face her. "Once the divorce is settled, I'm going to step away from the company for a while. Focus on things that matter." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "Like charity," Harvey said, a sense of resolve in his voice. "I've been thinking about the money Lauren stole, the way it's going to be returned. I want to do more. I want to use my resources for something good, for people who really need it." Emily smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "That sounds like a wonderful idea." Harvey nodded. "And I want you to help me." Emily blinked, surprised. "Me?" "Yes," Harvey said, his voice firm. "You have the right heart for this. You've always been about helping others, doing what's right. I can't think of anyone better to have by my side." For the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly seen. not as an employee, but as an equal. The idea of working alongside Harvey, of building something meaningful together, filled her with a quiet sense of joy. "I'd be honored," she said softly. Harvey smiled again, feeling more certain of his path than he had in months. The road ahead would still be difficult, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. And with Emily by his side, he knew he wasn't facing it alone. As they sat together in the quiet morning light, the future no longer felt uncertain. It felt full of possibility. Lauren sat at the dining table, the cold silence of the mansion wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. The once vibrant home that had hosted glamorous parties and important meetings now felt like a hollow shell, stripped of the life it once had. She stared at the divorce papers in front of her, the stark black letters spelling out the finality of her downfall. It was all over. Harvey had won, and she was about to lose everything she had spent years building. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling slightly as she hovered over the signature line. This was it. Once she signed, there would be no going back. No more wealth, no more influence. The life she had so meticulously crafted was gone, unraveling before her eyes. For a brief moment, Lauren considered not signing. She thought about fighting harder, dragging out the process in court, making things as difficult as possible for Harvey. But deep down, she knew it was pointless. He had all the evidence, all the leverage, and besides, what would she be fighting for? A marriage built on lies, a reputation that had already crumbled. With a heavy sigh, Lauren pressed the pen to the paper and signed her name. The ink bled slightly onto the page, sealing her fate. She sat back in her chair, staring at the signature, feeling an overwhelming sense of loss. It wasn't just the money or the power she mourned. It was the realization that she had built her entire life on a foundation that was never real. As she sat in the silence, the door to the room creaked open, and Harvey entered. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He had once loved this woman, but now, as he stood there, all he felt was sadness for what could have been. "It's done," Lauren said quietly, her voice flat. "I've signed the papers." Harvey nodded, stepping forward to take the papers from the table. "Thank you," Lauren scoffed, a bitter smile curling her lips. "Thank you. For what? For ending my life as I know it." Harvey sighed, his voice soft but firm. "No, Lauren, for doing the right thing. Finally." She flinched at his words, but there was no more fight left in her. She knew he was right. The battles she had waged, against him, against the world, even against herself, had all been for nothing. Now, she was left with the wreckage. "So, what happens now?" Lauren asked, her voice small, almost fragile. Harvey looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he spoke to her with a sense of finality. "Now, you move on. You start over. We both do." Lauren laughed, though it sounded more like a choke. "Start over? With what? You're taking everything." "I'm not taking everything," Harvey said quietly. "You'll have the settlement. It's enough to rebuild if you choose to." Lauren didn't respond. She knew the settlement would pale in comparison to the life she once had. But perhaps Harvey was right. Perhaps she could start over. The thought scared her more than anything. Harvey turned to leave, but he paused at the door, looking back at her one last time. "I don't wish you harm, Lauren. I hope you find a way to be happy, truly happy." And with that, he walked out, leaving Lauren alone in the empty mansion, the silence pressing in once more. She stared at the door for a long time, trying to process everything that had just happened. The house, the wealth, the social circles, it had all meant everything to her. But now, it was gone. And maybe, just maybe, she could learn to live without it. As for Harvey, walking away from Lauren felt like a burden being lifted from his shoulders. The finality of the divorce, while painful, had also brought a sense of closure. He was ready to move on with his life, a life built on honesty and integrity, not the deceit that had clouded his marriage for years. Later that afternoon, Harvey found himself in the garden, a place he had always retreated to when he needed to clear his mind. The flowers were in full bloom, the air filled with the scent of fresh roses and jasmine. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had consumed his life just months ago. As he walked along the stone path, he saw Emily by the greenhouse, tending to a row of newly planted flowers. She looked up when she saw him, a soft smile spreading across her face. Harvey approached her, his heart feeling lighter in her presence. "Everything's settled," he said, his voice carrying a sense of finality. "The papers are signed. It's over." Emily wiped her hands on her apron and stood, meeting his gaze. "How do you feel?" Harvey considered her question for a moment, then smiled. "Relieved. Ready to move forward." Emily smiled back, a warmth in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." They stood in the garden for a while, the soft breeze rustling the leaves around them. It felt different now, peaceful, hopeful. For the first time in months, Harvey could see a future, one not defined by the mistakes of the past. "Have you thought more about the charity work?" Emily asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Harvey nodded. "I have. And I want you to help me, Emily. You have the heart for it. You understand what it means to help people, and I can't think of anyone better to lead this with me." Emily's eyes widened slightly, surprised by the offer. "Me? But—" "Yes?" Harvey interrupted, smiling. You've helped me see the world in a different way. Emily, I think together we could make a real difference." Emily looked down for a moment, her cheeks flushing slightly. She had never imagined herself in such a role, but Harvey's belief in her was undeniable. Slowly, she nodded. "I'd love to help." Harvey smiled, feeling a sense of excitement building within him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like his life had purpose again. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building something new, something meaningful. As they stood together in the garden, the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the flowers and trees. Harvey turned to Emily, a soft smile on his face. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Emily nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Yes, we have." "But now," Harvey said, his voice full of hope, "we get to start over, and this time, we're doing it the right way." Emily smiled, and in that moment, everything felt right. The chaos of the past, the pain of betrayal, it was all behind them now. Ahead of them lay a future filled with possibility, with hope, and with the promise of something better. Together, they walked back toward the house, ready to face whatever came next.